And good afternoon, everyone. This is Jason Horejs from Xanadu Gallery, your host and moderator for this afternoon's workshop with Michael Stern, Photography Basics for Artists. It is Wednesday, February 8th, 2012, and I'd like to welcome you to this broadcast. I know there's a lot of interest in this topic. Just briefly as we begin, I'd like to go over some of the logistics of the broadcast for those of you who are participating perhaps for the first time in an online workshop. You'll be able to participate this afternoon in several different ways. You'll be able to watch the online slideshow presentation that Michael will be giving. Of course, you'll be able to listen to him, and most importantly, this is an interactive forum where you'll be able to ask questions. You can do that in one of two ways, or actually you can do it in both two ways if you would like. There is on the right-hand side of your screen in the GoToWebinar control panel a question box, which is basically a chat window where you can type your questions in. We'll be able to see those questions in, and at various points throughout the workshop, we'll pause to take those questions, and then also at the end we'll have a question and answer period. You can also ask questions audibly if you have a microphone attached to your computer. You'll let me know that you have a question by clicking on the yellow hand icon. That lets me know that you have a question and have a microphone attached, and again at various points throughout the broadcast we'll bring you in live. Now I will mention that sometimes the technology doesn't work as well as we'd like it to, and perhaps your microphone isn't connected the way it needs to be, and we might not be able to get you in live. But if you're not able to get in audibly, you can, like I say, go ahead and type your question in. I will also mention that there will be a recording of this broadcast available, so if you run into any technical difficulties during the presentation, don't worry, you'll be able to go back in and listen to the entire presentation and see the video via downloadable recording afterwards. And Michael will also be providing a PDF of the presentation for you to reference back to. So to begin, I'd like to introduce our guest today. Our guest presenter is Michael E. Stern, and I'm only going to take brief excerpts from his biography, as it is an extensive one, and if I were to go over all of it, it would take up a good deal of our time. But he has owned and operated small and medium and large commercial studios in California, including Hollywood and Burbank. He has shot for the Walt Disney Company, Warner Brothers, Universal, Paramount Studios, and he's also had extensive commercial experience photographing executives, celebrities, products, and architecture. Michael has taught and continues to teach at a variety of educational venues, teaching photographic theory, Photoshop, pre-press, and art business practices, and how to be successful at self-employment. Michael's written a book, Build a Better Photograph, A Disciplined Approach to Creativity, and he hosts a radio show, Build a Better Photograph. And so with that, I would like to welcome Michael, and I'm going to turn the presentation over to him. Welcome.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate that intro. That bio always impresses me so much, I can't wait to meet me. Thank you all for attending on today's presentation. I would like to just sort of back up briefly and let you know how Jason and I met and how this came about. It's something I think that is important when you work for yourself. I took one of Jason's workshops a couple of years ago. He was on a tour through Southern California, and I found Jason to be very humble and well-spoken, articulate and clear, obviously educated and experienced and friendly, and really enjoyed the presentation and approached him afterwards with this idea of collaborating and putting together photography-based information, photography-specific based information for the audience of fine artists that he was approaching. And 2 years later, the stars have lined up, and here we are today. So I appreciate that, Jason. We are going to have about 3 breaks in this presentation, and we will take questions. I have built this presentation for you from the experience of me as a professional photographer, but trying to imagine myself as a fine artist as the audience. So I've broken down the information in a way that I hope is accessible to you. For some of you math and science people, there are a couple of technical things in it that may appeal to you, but for the most part, it's fairly straightforward. you were encouraged to have your camera manuals with you, and if you do, that makes it all the much easier. But if not, you should still be able to follow along. So with that, let's get started. This is just a little disclaimer. This presentation is for your personal use, and if you'd like to post it on the blog or send it somewhere, if you could let me know, I'm sure it won't be a problem. I'd just like to be aware of it. Thank you very much for respecting that. Photography basics, camera controls, and the study of light. We're also going to talk a little bit about exposure and how to control that, how to measure it on the back of your camera, and then we're going to finish up with kind of a fun little set of pictures and help us identify some of the things we've learned today. So hopefully you're going to understand the basic camera controls, the qualities of light and exposure, and hopefully you'll be able to build better photographs afterwards. And the reason I say build photographs is this particular sentence here. I really believe this mantra: a successful photograph is a series of small decisions made correctly. And if we break down some of these ideas for today, and we're going to dive deep into each one of these three things, but within these three areas, there are little decisions we can make that'll help ensure your photographs turn out the expected way for use on the web, for use in printing in brochures, or for personal printing and hanging in your own home. We want to try to set the camera in a way that minimizes how it manipulates the files in the camera, and also how to minimize what you do post-capture. The camera has a miniature version of Photoshop, if you will, in the camera, and we want to make sure we understand what it's doing to the file so we can get as much flexibility out of the data as possible for all the various uses we might have. So these are the things that we're going to cover in the first part, or actually the entire presentation. And we're going to go through these step by step in this order. So be sure to take notes if you want to, if you're comfortable, but as Jason said, we'll be recording this and you're going to get a PDF of this exact presentation after the fact. And just as an aside, the photograph you're seeing right here is what we call a shallow depth of field, or a limited depth of field, or selective focus, or small depth of field. Any one of those terminologies references this kind of photograph where the foreground is in focus and the background is out of focus. It's also sometimes referred to as DOF, or depth of field. That's just a little aside, but I wanted to bring that up right in the beginning. I do apologize. I'm getting over the flu, so I'm a little bit hoarse, and I do have some water with me, so it should be fine. So we want to start off with the white balance and understand that light is color, and different lights, sunlight, open shade, fluorescent light, tungsten, flash, all produce different types of colors, and we are able to neutralize the differences, but the camera is not capable of doing that without us getting involved in the settings, and that's the first thing we're going to talk about. So the cameras all have presets, and we can set the white balance to match the main light source. And of course we have to understand how to identify that light source, which we'll get into. This is just a little background. We use what's called the Kelvin scale, developed by a man named William Thomson. And the scale he developed assigns a numerical value to the light sources. And he developed it based on watching a candle flame. If you think about the flame in a candle, at the very wick, it's blue and white light, and that's the hottest temperature, the highest number. And as the flame goes out towards the ends, it gets redder and then finally ends orangey. And that orange flame is the coolest temperature-wise in terms of number, but the warmest color. And so this is kind of an inverse scale that he's adapted. So the low numbers on the scale represent a warm color, and a high number represents a cool color. And this is how the cameras are designed to perform. And when you're shooting in the raw format, where the camera is not doing a whole lot of information, a whole lot of processing, we want to set the white balance to the main light source. And I have a chart coming up that will pretty much reference in your camera's manual what the icons look like and how to change them. If you're working in JPEG, it's very important to set the right white balance, because once that data is burned into the file when the camera processes JPEG, even though you can change it later, it can cause printing issues in terms of corruption and noise and artifacts and things. So we want to try to get it right when you're shooting in JPEG. If you're shooting in the RAW format, which we'll discuss at length later, it doesn't really matter because it's not being burned into the data. When the camera shoots JPEG, it's set in stone, and when you're shooting in RAW, it's a little data file that tells another program how to interpret it, and we'll clear that up. I will get to that later. Just kind of want to give you an overview. So we have certain settings: tungsten for indoors, sunlight for clear sky or overcast or cloudy, and I would suggest that you invest in some sort of neutral color target, or include a gray card or a white card or a black card, and that will help you clean up any kind of color issues, and we'll again discuss that at length as it comes up. You'll typically find this in your camera manual, and the icons are listed on the left and what the mode is in the center column, and in the approximate range. All the manufacturers, Nikon, Sony, Canon, Olympus, all have different ranges that they assign these icons to. So you'll see some variation throughout various manuals, and even within camera models of the same manufacturer. The Canon 5D series of cameras has a different range than their T2i Rebel series. So it's really a little confusing that there's so much variation. And especially I'd like to point you in the direction of the fluorescent light source. There is a lot of variation now. Prior, fluorescent lights really were kind of a cyan green color, and now you can get daylight fluorescent tubes, which are close to 6,500 degrees Kelvin, and you can get all the way down to almost tungsten-like fluorescent, which are very warm. So we have to understand, if you're in open shade, which is under a patio, let's say, or if you're in a dining room and there's windows, large windows and lights coming in, that's kind of open shade. And that light source is in the 7,000 to 9,000, 8,000, which means it's kind of a cool color. Remember, the higher the number, the cooler the color. And if we're in indoors and you have a traditional light bulb that you're turning on, that's considered more of a tungsten light, and it's a lot warmer color. And so its number is closer to 3,200. So we have to be very aware when we're shooting of what the light source is. If we're working in JPEG, or if we're working in RAW, you could put it on automatic white balance, because you're going to set the color after the fact. It doesn't really matter much, but we want to stay away from automatic in JPEG, and we can address that if the question comes up why. I think I talk about that in a little bit. But you check your owner's manual. The last two icons are custom and manual. If you know the color temperature of your light, you can dial it in. You have specific numbers you can plug into your camera. That's kind of a more advanced thing. And then the custom, it used to be before, if you invest in a color target like I'm suggesting, you don't have to worry about custom white balance. But you can get a specific color white balance at the time of shooting if you photograph a piece of white paper under the light source you're going to be photographing under, and it's perfectly dialed in. But if you shift your camera or change the light in any way, that custom white balance goes out the door. So it's got its good and bad features, but the icons are pretty accurate, and if you want to work with those, that's what they're doing for you. Now, here's the trade-off, though. These objects that you see right here were photographed in a dining room, in a kitchen nook. There's a door open, and it's flooding light, and this is what we call soft, diffused, indirect light. And I photographed the scene with all the various settings in the prior screen. And you can see the color in the upper the upper left corner is kind of neutral, kind of cool. And as we go left to right, the color gets warm, and in some cases the color is really too warm. In other cases it seems to be less warm. The third one on the far right middle row seems to be pretty nice. But if you notice on the far right lower corner, I put in a little color target. and I photograph that in every scene when I'm doing these kinds of object photographs, because as you can see, there's great variation, and I'm not going to remember what is exactly the right color. But if I put a target in the scene, then when I get to the next picture, I can click on any one of those white or gray squares, and the software that I use, either Picasa or iPhoto or GIMP or Photoshop or Elements or Lightroom or Aperture, any one of those programs, I can click with an eyedropper tool, and these targets are designed to neutralize color differences, and I can get absolute dead-on, spot-on color without having to really know color theory or be very, very hip about all that, or very savvy. This takes a lot of the guesswork out of it. It cleans up any color cast introduced by the light, and I'm good to go. Now what I have here are two separate products. The Data Color Spider Checker is on the left, and the X-Rite Color Checker Passport is on the right. Now the Data Color is a bigger product, and if you notice there's a little red square in the lower left. When these targets fade over time because of the atmospheric conditions and the material used to create these color squares have faded, that red turns to pink, and you know it's time to replace those inserts, and you're always going to have a primo rated target. The X-Rite, on the other hand, is very nice because it's small and it fits in your pocket. And it has a fade chart as well, but it's not as accurate, I've come to find. But the way you use these is, here's a typical scene. On the left, I picked what I thought was the right color temperature in the camera, open shade because it was on a table, light coming in through an open door. And I clicked on the squares, either one of the set of gray squares on the far right side of either panel, white to black on the left-hand panel and black to white on the right-hand panel. Click on any one of those neutral squares and you will neutralize the color. And as you can see the difference from the left frame to the right frame, how easy it is to correct. You didn't have to really know color other than clicking on a neutral target. And the image on the right, what's nice about the X-Rite is within that red vertical rectangle, those are tints. Once you correct the color to be spectrally neutral, is the technical term, you can click on any of those tints if you want to just slightly warm up or slightly cool down the picture for a particular application, or you just like things to be correct for printing but have a little bit of a warm bias, let's say. So that's what's nice about the X-Rite, is you can neutralize and get dead neutral, but then you can kind of tint and make it a little bit warmer. And these are nice. They run about $100. But it's well worth the investment if you're going to take up photography on your own. I'm a professional. I know color theory. I can correct to the numbers in Photoshop, but I put these in the scene because it makes my life a lot more efficient and easier. So I would recommend color targets. Here's another one. This is also a nice one. This is a spider checker cube. It's a Data Color spider cube. And if you look at the picture on the left, again, this is open shade. It's sitting on a table in a dining room. There's a big window. The sun is about noon in the sky, and it's coming in through the window. And the picture looks okay, but if you look at the photograph on the right, I have color corrected by clicking on the white triangle. And then I clicked on the black on the bottom. And notice there's two separate blacks. There's a dark circle, which is called the trap black, and then there's the other black, which is the reproducible black. You have to think about the end result. There's going to be ink on paper, and ink absorbs into the paper and wipes out detail. In this particular tool, if you click on the black face and not the trap, it'll set that difference between the two, and the black trap is black without detail in printing. The other black is black that's going to print with detail. And if you look at the face of the Kachina doll in both pictures, you see much more detail in the doll on the right. And that detail is going to print. It's going to hold in a brochure or on a website or on an inkjet print, because this spider cube has allowed you to distribute the tones in the file across a broader spectrum and make it more reproducible. What's also nice about this is it's plastic, and unlike the previous two products, the color is not going to fade because it's built into the plastic. It's fairly durable. You can drop it on the ground, bounce around. It's not going to break. And this thing is about $50. And I use it. It's a little clunky because you got to screw it into a stand, or you can hang it from that little string you see. But again, put it in one shot of everything you're photographing, and then in your post-processing protocol, your workflow, use your eyedropper and click on that white panel to set the color, and click on the black to set your shadow values. And it really is very simple. There is a instruction sheet that comes with this particular product, but it's also a good one. And you can see how the color has been cleaned up and the shadows have been opened up, and you'll be able to reproduce those in virtually any printing environment. And this leads into our next topic, which is the way cameras, printers, and monitors, scanners develop and process and manage color is all different. And if we think of red, rojo, and rouge, they're all the same color, but they're in different languages. And to understand that rouge is red in English, we need a translator, and color management is our translator. And that's how we can get predictable color from the camera to our computers out to the printer. And one of the first steps we want to go to in our camera setting, and here's where you can get out your manuals, is look at color space. These are screens from a 5D Mark II, your Nikon, Olympus, and Sony screens, and some other models of Canons are going to be slightly different. But if you look in your specifications manual for color space, you're going to see 2. And by default, the manufacturers set it to sRGB. This is a legacy setting. Back when cameras were not very high resolution and you weren't really printing them, you were making pictures and sticking them on an email or up on a blog, the color didn't have to be so accurate or very good. And sRGB is an explanation of color information that's suited for the limited capacity of monitors. But if you're going to print, then you need more color information in your file. The camera is capable of generating a lot of color information. Adobe 98 helps you display the color your camera can reproduce. And the thinking behind, let's go back one, sorry. The thinking behind this is you create a file with a lot of information, more color information than you may need for the web, or higher resolution than you may need for the web, or more editing flexibility. But if you create a large file, then it's easier to downsample it and step it down and massage the data into the proper form than it is to start with a small file and realize, oh, I need more color, I need it larger to do this other thing. So the idea is to start large, create a big ball of data, and then downsample it as you go through the process. So my files come out of the camera at 25 megabytes. I work with them typically in hundreds and hundreds of megabytes, and then when I'm ready to go out to the web, then I can downsample it and set it down. But then if I also want to take that big file and go out to a printer, I have the data there to do that. So that's the idea. It's better to be big and then get small. Again, if you're going to shoot, I would recommend working in raw files because it is really just a set of data points that then software like Camera Raw or Lightroom or Picasa or whatever takes that data and you control the information and you make the file you want. And it's a proprietary format, meaning every manufacturer creates their own software to process it, but Adobe's done a really great job of making software that will also read raw files. JPEG, on the other hand, is very universal. Any reader, any computer can read it. And if you are going to shoot JPEG, however, then set it to the highest possible setting, which is the lowest compression. And you should read your camera manuals and find out if it's been listed as best, fine, super fine, large, high quality, great. Every manufacturer has their different way of defining what is their largest JPEG. Now, in these icons you see on the screen here on the bottom, Canon has 2 types of medium files and 2 types of small files. And the large good JPEG has that smooth radius, and the slightly better large file has that sort of stair step. So they have these quirky ways of representing the information. You should learn what is the best setting. If you're not sure, most cameras can shoot RAW and JPEG together, so you could always do that and work with the JPEG, but then when you get more experience or you have someone that knows how to work with RAW files, give them the RAW file and let them show you what the possibilities exist working with the raw data. That being said, if you do understand what you're doing, JPEGs can produce great prints with great detail and tonal range, but you do have to really watch the exposure, which is really the big issue, and we're going to get into a little bit later. And I sort of went over this as well. Previous slide, I'm a little bit behind on the timing, sorry about that. But iPhoto, Picasa, Elements, GIMP, Photoshop, Aperture, there's all kinds of programs that can work with raw files, so it's not just a Photoshop thing. Also, your camera comes with software that can read the raw file. But if you're going to be performing the functions your camera does when in JPEG mode, JPEG in the camera sets the sharpening, sets the color, sets the contrast, sets the size, and that's actually created in the camera, and the rest of the data the camera has created is thrown away. And that's what the difference is between the two formats. The JPEG is kind of set in stone, although you can edit it later. But if you want to work with the raw file and have all the flexibility and do some of the things that the camera's performing, you're going to have to learn additional software, and the learning curve is almost vertical, and it's greased. And it's more like a learning highway, and there's just a few guardrails and stop signs. It's going to take you some time to get up to speed on it, but it's well worth the effort. But we're going to concentrate on how to make better photos regardless of the file format, so hopefully that'll ease your mind a little bit. Picture style is the next thing we want to talk about. And in Nikon, I think it's called picture control, and Sony and Olympus, I believe, call it picture mode, and Canon calls it picture style. And when we turn the analog information, when you point your camera and click the shutter, that analog scene that you're photographing gets turned into individual pixel values, and there's a loss of sharpness and color and contrast. And picture styles try to get some of that back. As light energy goes through the lens and strikes the sensor, the ADC, which is the analog to digital converter, which is the brains of the camera, processes this light energy into ones and zeros. And when you're in JPEG, you can set how much of that processing goes on. But once it's set, changing it after the fact can affect the quality. Whereas when you're working with raw files, that doesn't get attached to the file. You create a picture style post-capture processing. So when I'm working in picture style, I use what's called neutral or faithful. And I set that in the Canon settings, and then I apply my own aesthetics. And there are several types of picture styles in all of the cameras. And when I say landscape or portrait faithful to custom, landscape creates pictures that have a little bit more of a blue bias and a little bit more contrast to them, because typically you're photographing rocks and streams and leaves and flowers and skies and clouds and grass and water and those kinds of things. Whereas portrait, it's assuming you're working with skin tone, so it tends to create files that have a little bit more red to them because of skin tone and the ruddiness of a complexion, and it's not quite as sharp because you're talking about skin tone. I don't really want the camera to make some of those choices for me. I want to apply those choices afterwards. So faithful has the camera do it in a minimal or neutral fashion. It's not saturating the color. It's not making the picture any sharper than the lens is making it. It's not adding any more contrast. But you should shoot the same scene with each picture style and look at that on your computer and see which picture style is the most beneficial for you. Now again, in the Canon 5D, here's how it's listed, and you'll navigate to that and you click on that with the large dial in the back of the camera, and you'll see all of the choices pop up. Faithful and neutral are essentially the same thing, What I also like in the particular in the Canon is the faithful. It tends to keep the highlights from getting too bright. And one of the things that makes it very difficult in reproduction is highlights without detail that are paper white. You lose form, you lose shape, you lose texture. Picture style faithful tends to recapture that or keep it from getting pushed out in the first place. So that would be my recommendation. So here's what picture style would do. On the left, I don't know if it's coming across with the compression on this webinar, but the Cam Original is a little bit soft. You can see that, and picture style will sharpen it and add some contrast. And that's great if you know what you're doing, but I would rather apply that sharpening afterwards so I can control and dial in exactly what I want, as opposed to having the camera do a preset that if I think it's too sharp, then I have to soften it, and then I'm starting to manipulate the file after the fact and going down a rabbit hole that I don't really want to go down. So I have the camera do as minimal as possible, and then I add it after the fact. Jason?
Yes, Michael.
Jason, are there any questions for people? I thought maybe we could just add a kind of, I don't know how fast I'm going here, but I thought if there were any questions before we go on.
Yeah, there are. I mean, you've kind of covered some of them, and some of them I think are going to be more, you know, kind of general questions that we'll want to save toward the end.
Okay.
Let me just check.
Am I going too fast for people?
No, I think we're doing okay so far.
Okay.
And again, we do have the recording available, so anything that you miss, you can go back and check. But it looks like we're in good shape for right now, and I'll save these questions for a little bit later on.
And folks, I'm happy to hang out after the fact, and if you want to go audio and have a chat with me, I'm certainly down for that. So my time is yours today, no worries. So once so the next thing we want to set in the camera is the metering modes, and there are many schemes, but the top two are spot, and if you look at this icon, it's taking 100% of its measurement of the light reflecting off the subject from the between 3 and 5% of the center of the screen. Is getting all of its information for how it's setting the camera controls, aperture, and shutter speed from this tiny center spot. And the other mode that you want to think about is evaluative or matrix. I believe evaluative is the Canon version, and matrix is what Nikon calls it. I don't know what Sony and Olympus call theirs, but it's essentially full screen. The viewfinder is divided into segments, and all of the light reflecting off of the subject is calculated into the exposure. So it's looking at the entire screen and not just the center. These are the two most commonly used. You might find in your manual some center-weighted averages or partial spot. Kind of ignore those because they're not really full spot and they're not really full evaluative, and they're sort of taking a slightly bigger area, and you can get into trouble because you either want to know dead center that it's taking the information or from the full scene, and I'll explain why that is in a little bit. These two, I'm on one or the other all the time. I don't bother with the others. They can get you in trouble. I would recommend just staying with these. They'll have a lot more information to go by. If you start experimenting too much, you start introducing variables into the process, and then you start having to troubleshoot those extra variables, and it can just get a little bit more than you want to handle. So these are very accurate because it's clear where in the scene the light measurement is being taken from. Now, when the sun is at your back, let's say you're at a football game and you're in the crowd and you want to take a picture of the scene out on the stadium floor and it's sunlight. The sun's at your back. Everything's getting full light. Everything's getting about the same amount of light energy. Evaluative is pretty good. Or perhaps those examples I showed earlier of in the house, the open shade, the figurines on the table, the lights coming in from an open door. That's pretty much a broad light source. Everything's getting the same amount of light energy. Evaluative is a good choice because everything is reflecting the light. But if the sun is at the back of the subject, let's say it's backlit, You have somebody outdoors, let's say you're shooting a reference photo for a painting and you want light to come in on the hair and get that kind of halo. The sun is at the subject's back. You're shooting into the sun. That's a backlight. You get that rim light. The sun is at the back. Put it on spot mode, and then the meter will take the exposure from the person's face and not everything around the person. So when the light source is very, very narrow like that, you're better off going into spot mode. And then you want to point your camera at a part of the scene that would look like medium gray if the color had been removed. And that's usually where I get this word. So let me explain this. Your meter in your camera is called a reflective meter. Light hits a subject and bounces off, and it averages the light. And they see tone, not color, and it's often referred to as middle gray or 18%. So if you're pointing your camera at a light yellow flower, what the camera sees is light gray. It sees the color without the color in it. And if you're pointing your camera at a red apple, that apple is really dark gray. And it's important to understand this. So you're pointing your camera at a full range scene when in evaluative mode and at a mid-tone value in a spot mode. Skin tones are kind of a mid-tone value. A medium blue sweater is kind of a medium gray sweater. A sort of dark pink blouse is kind of a medium gray color or medium gray value. So you can start to see a cobalt blue is a dark gray, so that's not a mid-tone. We need to kind of try to find a mid-tone value. And these are getting a little bit more technical, but this is how the meter is working. It's trying to find a middle gray, and it takes a lot of practice. So in this sample here, that's what we see with our eye, but that's how the camera is reading it. And I was in evaluative mode here, and so the camera is reading off the grass, off the hills, off the sky, off that headstone, and you can see that the preponderance of tones are about the middle gray, the grass and the hill, and it worked out just fine. If I was in spot mode, this would have worked out well too, because the spot mode would have been pointing at the grass as well. If I wasn't sure, if you try to imagine digital photography breaks color down into chrominance and luminance. What is the color of it and what is the brightness value? The camera is just looking at the brightness value. So if you can start to imagine color as value, that pinwheel is kind of a medium gray. The grass is kind of a medium gray. Try to learn to see in tone instead of color. And if you are unsure, then if you get one of these targets or get a gray card, you can go to the camera store and get one and put that in the scene and take your meter reading off that gray card, and you won't have a problem trying to decide what is a middle value gray. This is the part that takes a little bit of practice for photographers, but it is the way meters are working. Any questions about that part that I can readdress perhaps, or shall we move on?
I think that most of these questions are going to, again, be kind of generally applicable. I've got questions to the effect of, what if someone's not using a very complicated camera, they're using more of a point and shoot? Do these same principles apply even if the mechanics are a little bit different?
Yes, I would say yes. Yeah, point and shoot. We're going to get into the AV and TV modes and what those mean and what the camera's doing when we get into the exposure part. But yes, a point and shoot camera, the principles are the same. You're looking for the highest. Now, some of the lower end cameras may not have the ability to shoot RAW. If your camera's more than 3 years old, probably doesn't if it's a $200 camera or less. So if that's what you have, then you want to try to find, you want to find the highest JPEG setting, and it does have an Adobe 98 color space, and you want to try to have the most neutral picture style or picture setting or whatever your manual is calling it. A good camera today is about $350. This pretty much can do all the things I've been talking about so far.
Great, and I think that I'm going to hold on to the other questions because I can already see that you're going to be covering a lot of them.
Okay, I just lost you there, Jason.
Oh, sorry about that. Go ahead, Michael. I think we're good.
Okay. So we've set the white balance to whatever the main light source is if we know what it is. If not, then we can go with auto white balance. We've set the picture style. We've set the color space. We have set the metering mode, which is either spot or evaluative. So we've got those. We're working in either RAW or JPEG or maybe both. So we've got some of our settings down. And now, if you're not comfortable with doing it manual exposure, where you manage the shutter speed and aperture settings yourself, then you can pick one of these other two, aperture variable or time variable. And I use aperture variable a lot. And the meters are so good today that in the past it was a little bit more of a crapshoot working with these automatic modes. But aperture variable is you set the aperture you want to shoot at, and the camera selects the shutter speed to achieve the correct exposure. And time variable, you set the shutter speed, and the camera picks the f-stop. Aperture, f-stop are interchangeable terms. And if you can know what you're doing beforehand, what you're trying to accomplish beforehand, it'll make picking one of these modes less stressful. For instance, if you're shooting an image that you want a specific f-stop, going back to that first picture in this presentation when I talked about the selective depth of field, I only wanted that foreground flower to be in focus. And I knew that a limited depth of field was required. So I had to have a limited depth of field. So I went into AV mode. I picked the aperture I wanted. And I'll get into this large aperture, small opening thing a little bit further down. And then the camera picked the shutter speed. So I knew ahead of time I wanted a limited depth of field. Now, if I want a lot of depth of field, I'm doing a big time-lapse movie I've been working on the last 8 months, and I need a lot of depth of field from the foreground where the camera is all the way to the background. So I have my lens down to a small aperture number, and I'm at f16. It's a small hole. I have a lot of depth of field. So depending on what you're doing will drive these decisions. And again, that's why I have that little verbiage on the bottom. A successful photograph is a series of small decisions made correctly. Conversely, if you're in time variable mode, for a long time I thought that was TV mode, and I'm thinking, is it a video function or is there a television somewhere? I always found these letters a little bit confusing. But if you want to freeze the action, I do a lot of sports photography. And if I don't want any kind of blur, I want to catch the basketball player going to the basket and everything edges crisply defined, then I'm going to go into time variable mode, pick the shutter speed that I want, and then the camera's going to pick the right aperture to match up. So exposure, as we're going to see a little bit later, is always a combination of shutter speed and aperture. There's two other elements we're going to get into, but these two work together, shutter speed and aperture, to make our pictures. So we have to keep remembering that. Now, conversely, if it's blur that I want, or if I want to create movement, then I want to slow the shutter speed down and let the shutter open for a longer amount of time so the action can move, and I'm going to get some blurry and soft edges. Now, this is different than camera shake. So there's two types of blur here. One blur is caused by the movement of the subject, and the other blur is caused by shaking of the camera. I always have a tripod in my car. When I'm doing photographs of artwork, whether it's two-dimensional artwork or sculptures or costumes or whatever it might be, I'm on a tripod. That way I've minimized one of the variables. I've made a decision to put the camera on a tripod, so if there's any kind of movement or blur, it's because I want there to be blur because the subject is moving or I'm trying to create movement. So that's one of the things I would recommend if you don't have is get a tripod, and also what goes along with that is some sort of cable release. That way you're not touching the camera when you're making the exposure. So that's also something that could be helpful. Now, sometimes when you're in these automatic modes, the exposure may be too dark or too light, and maybe you just haven't pointed the camera at the right tone. You don't know what the tone is. That's okay. If you go into what's called this exposure compensation control, this will allow you to make the camera automatically make the exposure lighter or darker. And as we'll see later on in the presentation, by looking at the histogram, we can tell if the exposure needs to have more light or less light added to it. So you can get your camera's manual and see the Canon adds the exposure compensation into what's called auto exposure bracketing, which is something different and we're not going to cover. But in this example here on the right, you can see that I've made the exposure compensation go up one stop. When the movement goes to the right, you're making the exposure lighter, and when the movement goes to the left, you're making the exposure darker. So if you have your camera on a tripod and you're pointing it at your piece of artwork or your sculpture, whatever it is, and you've got the right light and you've got the right picture style and you're shooting in RAW and you've got the right color space and everything's good and the picture's just too dark all the time, you can go to this exposure compensation and tell the camera to just make the picture lighter and try it at one stop. And if it's not bright enough, try it again at 2 stops. And usually that's going to be enough, but this is one way to compensate for consistently off-exposed pictures. Exposure compensation. Now, another way to check your exposure, excuse me 1 minute, I'm going to get some water. Another way to check your exposure is there's a graph built into every camera called the histogram, and it displays where the shadow, midtone, and highlight information is being distributed across your data file. Now you have 2 choices typically, brightness or luminosity, it may be called one or the other, and either color or RGB. RGB stands for red, green, and blue. I suggest you use the RGB mode because if you look at the far right screen capture here, this is what we call a luminosity exposure, and it just shows the brightness values distributed across the histogram, the graph. If you look closely, you'll see that the graph doesn't quite go all the way to the right. There's a little bit of a gap there. We call that gap headroom, but we don't know if it's in the red, the green, or the blue channel. And if we look at that graph on the far right, the left-hand side is touching the very edge. So we want to try to get the graph in the middle of this line. It's 256 steps, which we'll learn a little bit later. But if we look at it in the color mode, we can see that the red is evenly distributed all the way across, and the blue and the green have some headroom. And this is good information to know. This exposure is right on the button. There's a little bit of headroom in at least one of the channels, and that's enough information for your software to fully develop this information. This is also good as a JPEG. But if you look at the little screen, the little thumbnail of the scene, it looks like some of the areas are over bright and too blown out. And here's another reason to go by your histogram. The little LCD screen on the back of your camera is not designed to accurately represent the brightness values as they exist in the file. Manufacturers have never tried to connect the two. A little proxy thumbnail JPEG is generated very quickly from the data and presented on the LCD screen so you can see the composition or see if you've got the right moment captured or other types of taste issues, but it's not a gauge for accuracy of exposure. If the picture looks great on your LCD, it's probably underexposed. So if you bring up this view where you can see the histogram at the same time, you'll have a much more accurate representation. When in the Canon family, when the picture on the LCD looks bright and maybe washed out, the exposure is very accurate. But I do always check this histogram because it gives me a lot of information about the exposure. This is a very important thing, a very important setting to set histogram in color or RGB. A lot of you have little media cards that slide into the camera, and you want to format them all the time. And the formatting is different than erasing. Erasing actually deletes the data off the card. But what's really crucial in media cards is this file allocation table. It's called the FAT file. And it tells your camera and your computer where the files are stored on the card. So let's say you buy the card, you stick it in your camera, and you reset the FAT file for that card, and then the camera understands where it's going to place all the pictures that you have it make. And you take the card out, and you stick it in your computer, and you upload the files. And then you take the card, and you put it back into your camera, and you reformat it. And what that does is it resets the file, the FAT file, and the camera thinks the card's empty. Now, if you've inadvertently formatted, and then you realize I didn't really copy all the files I wanted, or there was a problem and I got to recopy the files still exist on the card. And you can use a photo software recovery program called Clicks to recover those pictures. If you take out the card, upload the files, put the card back in the camera, reformat, shoot pictures, and then realize, oh my God, there's pictures on that card I wanted to get back, you can still retrieve those pictures. They're still on the card. As long as the camera is not written over them with the new pictures, it's still retrievable. And that's another reason to have a big media card, 8 gigs or 16 gigs or larger, and this can help mitigate some of these kinds of issues. If you erase the files, reformatting is not going to get them back. Once they're erased, the data has been X'd over ones and zeros, and the camera sees it as blank. But formatting does something slightly different. I'm always a formatter. I don't erase. Unless I'm shooting and I don't have enough room on the card and I know I have some pictures I'm never going to use, then I will erase on the fly while I'm working. But otherwise, card goes out of the camera, into the computer. You can also transfer your files from the camera while it's plugged into your computer. You can also do that, but you're going to get a cleaner transfer and a little faster transfer if you use a card reader and stick your card into the card reader. I would recommend that rather than use your camera as the transfer medium. So formatting is the thing. So do we need a couple minutes to take a little break, take a little breather, let it all percolate in?
Yeah, and Michael,
that sound about right, Jason? Yeah.
If you're okay with it, I've got some questions that I could kind of throw to you during the break, or do you want to take a couple minutes off the air?
No, I meant I would answer questions and just sort of let people look at their notes, or if they wanted to ask questions, yes.
Okay. First of all, let me do this. I'm going to lower everyone's hand who currently had it raised because I wasn't sure how long you've had it raised. So if you'd like to ask a question audibly, go ahead and raise your hand again. Let me just take some of the various questions that we've gotten in. And this question comes from Gail. And she asked, actually, there are two parts to this question. One, could you suggest a good tripod? And then second, what camera do you primarily use in your photography?
My primary camera is a 5D Mark II. I do a lot of portrait work and small product, and that's what I like to use. My backup cameras are a 5D and a T2i Rebel. So I have 3 different cameras. I no longer use medium format or 4x5 view cameras. Nikon, Canon, Sony Olympus all make great cameras. You start getting into the $500 price range, and the cameras are kind of advanced amateur hobbyists, and they're all pretty good cameras. The 5D is Mark II is about a $2,500 body, but it's going to last a long, long time. And Canon, I'm just a Canon guy. It's like Ford versus Chevy. You know, Nikon, Canon, they're great cameras. They all do it. They get you where you want to go. It's just a question of, I find personally, being slightly dyslexic, that the Canon manuals are easier to read and understand, and the menu commands on the Canon, to me, for the way my little brain works, are much more logical. So I'm very comfortable in the Canon environment. So, you know, find what suits you, and they all are very good products. As far as tripods, I use old-style bulletproof, military-grade Gitzo iron legs. You can lift them for weights, they're so heavy. But Manfrotto makes very good lightweight tripods. They're carbon fiber. You can buy them at Amazon. You know, Really Right Stuff is here in Ventura, California. They make really high-end, very expensive, but great tripods. I would avoid going to Kmart or Target to buy a tripod. I think you're going to spend about $200 for a pair of legs and a head. A decent one is going to run you about $200, maybe $250. Anything below that, and it's probably not going to be very steady or sturdy, or eventually the lockdowns that make the legs extend and lock them in are eventually going to give way. So figure a budget of at least $200 for something halfway decent that will hold 35 millimeter. If you have a bigger camera, you know, up to like a 5D Mark II or a D300 on the Nikon side, you know, $200 tripod's probably going to work out okay. You start getting in a bigger camera, and you're starting into the $400, $500 tripod. But Manfrotto makes a very good product.
Great. And let's see if we can bring someone in live now. Let me try and go to William Majorossi.
Hello, William.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I must have had my hand up inadvertently.
Inadvertently. Oh, no problem.
I'm putting it down right now.
Okay, let's try going to Priscilla. Priscilla Stradler, are you there, and do you have a question?
I think I was inadvertent too. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
I was just curious though, if this workshop is great, and thank you so much, is it going to be covering lighting setup at all for studio work?
Oh, great question. And Michael, have I lost you? You know what? Hold on, Michael. Michael, I apologize. I muted you as well.
Okay. Okay. It's not going to cover specific lighting setups, but it is going to cover cross light, front light, diffuse light. But this workshop is kind of the first one to just introduce some of these broader concepts. And then we have another one planned where there'll be specific lighting setup for 2D copy work and 3D object photography. But the quality of light portion of this is really going to be more about how to identify the light that might be appropriate for your particular object that you want to photograph.
Okay, and Barbara Colo asked the question, or says she's shooting artwork that is on white paper with fine pencil lines. It's hard to photograph the paper as white as possible and not lose the pencil lines. Do you have any tips for her of what she should be doing other than what you've mentioned?
You might want to try sliding darker paper under the white and doing a couple of different exposures and blending them together. You might also possibly get more contrast if you polarize the light and the lens, meaning part of why you're getting a faded pencil line. I just actually was helping a student with this about a year ago. If the light is polarized and there's a polarizing filter on the lens, then you're having the light only hit the artwork at one lighting angle, and it's going to be easy in something like RAW to up the contrast. In fact, the clarity slider in both Lightroom and Camera Raw and in Photoshop proper allows you to tone specific areas like pencil lines. And it's also then going to be an issue of making multiple layered files in Photoshop and changing the blend mode to enhance the differences between the pencil line and the paper. And you're going to have to build up the density similar to how you're build the paint on a canvas. So that kind of thing is kind of unique. It's so delicate that we have to go into Photoshop and kind of enhance it a bit. If you don't have polarized lighting, that would be the way that I would approach that. That's a toughie, but it can be done.
Okay, and let's try one more audible question, and let me go to Mary Gruber. Mary, are you there, and do you have a question? Oh, and apparently Mary is not there. So I'll shoot it back over to you, Michael.
Okay, so we'll move on here. So let's talk about the qualities of light. Photographs are basically two-dimensional recreations of light reflected off a subject, and therefore the characteristics of our light literally make the photograph, and we have two qualities of light, formative and comparative. And just FYI, this is a photograph, this is a backlit situation. The sun is flaring into the scene, and yet you can still make dramatic pictures this way. I did set the camera to evaluative on this one and let it just render the scene how it was going to render it. I knew the sun was going to be very bright. I wanted that kind of drama of the footsteps in the sand. But this is something where you would experiment, try it in evaluative, try it in spot, and then take the exposure compensation and have the camera deliberately underexposed after it makes its calculations and deliberately overexposed. This is one of those things where you might want to take a bracket of 5 or 6 or 7 exposures and see which one feels right, because as we're going to find out later, there's the technically correct exposure and then there's the aesthetically pleasing exposure, and they aren't necessarily the same thing all the time. And just also a little aside, if you notice the little starburst coming off the sun, that tells you that the lens was stopped down, that I had a lot of depth of field in the picture. I was down to f16 or f11, so I had a very small hole in the lens. And because of that, the sun bends around the blades in the shutter and the blades in the iris of the lens, excuse me, and that gives you that characteristic twinkle effect. So that's one way to start deconstructing photographs and identifying perhaps what camera controls were used. So the formative or structural parts of light are direction, specular, and diffused. Direction is self-explanatory. Where is the light coming from? In this case, it's coming from in front of us. It could be coming from the side, could be coming from the top, could be coming from the back. Specular is direct light. This is specular light. It is diffused. I'm sorry, it is pointed. It's the sun. It's pointed right at the lens. This is a specular or hard light source. One of its characteristics is hard shadows. And if you look at the shadows in the footprints, they're pretty solid. They're very well delineated. And that's also a characteristic of specular or hard light or direct light. And then the other light, diffused light, we've been looking at that in some of the examples that I've shown you earlier today. And these are built into the scene. It's very difficult to change these. If you want to change the direction of the light and you're working outdoors, you either have to wait for a different time of day or turn your camera and subject relative to the camera position. They're very structural. They're hard to change after the fact. You want to diffuse the light. In Photoshop, you can do a little bit of that, but it's hard to take diffused light and make it more directional afterwards. So these are really foundation and formative, and you have a hard time changing them afterwards. So here are some examples. Direct sunlight on the far left. I just put a little table outdoors. I put this vase out there. I threw in some wheat flowers. I have a very limited depth of field. I have the lens wide open. It's a very shallow depth of field, and it's direct sunlight. And if you notice, the shadow on the right-hand side is very dark. Now the picture to the left of it, I'm sorry, the picture to its right, I put a fill card in on the far right-hand side. And if you compare the two, that's the only difference. I put a white card in there. I moved it in until I saw it take away that dark shadow. The size of the card, the angle of the light, and what you're trying to accomplish dictate how close or far away that card is. So you need to experiment. Usually the card needs to be at least twice as large as the object in order to fill in evenly. So that's kind of a rule of thumb. So if this is a 10-inch object, you want a 20-inch card minimum. And then it is a diffused, it's like, you know, cold press watercolor board. You want to make sure the board doesn't have any kind of color bias to it. Try to get it as neutral as possible. And that is only difference between these two pictures. Now, the difference between pictures 2 and 3 is I just moved my object where there was shade in the background. So picture number 1 and 2 is a fence way far in the background of my backyard. And picture number 3 is I have a big shade tree, and I positioned this object in the sun, but in front of the shade being cast by the tree, and the background goes very dark. I did use the fill card in that picture as well. And you can see the difference by having a dark background, how this object really jumps out of the background. And you notice on picture number 3, the cast shadow is going slightly away and to the left of the object. That tells you that the sun is over my right shoulder because the shadow is going away to the left-hand corner. So that is also a good way of identifying light direction. The picture on the far left, the sun's on the opposite side because the shadow is going away to the right. You can see it there on that stone base. So direction of sun, you can tell by the cast shadows. And the last picture is open shade. I waited till the sun moved in the sky enough where it fell below the roof of my house, and now the sky is a big soft pillow. It's a big soft box of light illuminating the scene evenly, and I put another fill card in there just to bring a little bit more glisten or shine, if you will, to the object. And you can see how bright the background is as well. It's behind and not directly hitting my object, but it's still hitting the background. So by being aware of how the light is falling on your object, on your background, you can get some very different effects with a very simple setup of a direct light and a fill card. The comparative qualities of light are also very important. What is the color temperature, or what is the hue? Is it a warm colored light? Is it a warm color? Is it a sunrise? As we see here, it's going to be a warm light. If we go back to these previous pictures, the light is more neutral because of the time of day. Contrast. Here on the previous pictures, we could see the contrast was relatively even on the object, even though on this third picture here, the object really stands out from the background. There's a lot of contrast in picture number 3. There's not so much contrast in picture number 4. And then the brightness. Is the image light or dark? In this picture, I would say it's kind of a low-key picture. It feels kind of moody and heavy. So these are more comparative qualities. So it's the direction, is it specular or diffused, and then what is its color or contrast or brightness. So these are the things that we have to think about. Objects that are very, very shiny tend to photograph better with diffused light. Objects that have a lot of texture, like a beach scene, tend to look better with a specular light. So let's look at some qualities of light. Early morning side light draws great texture. If you had a painting that you were photographing and you put it on the ground in early morning light, probably not the best quality of light, because the light is going to have a bias on one side or the other, and it may not illuminate your painting as well as it could unless you had a fill card, sort of like that vase, to punch light into the other side. Here's a backlit situation. Again, the sunrise is coming up. I have a silhouette shape of that big piece of driftwood on the beach, and it's very dramatic. It's very dark. It's very moody. It's very warm. So we can start giving light some of these attributes. This is a front light. This is a middle of the day. It's about noon. The little sunflower leaves, or whatever they are, this feather, the detritus on the ground, they're all catching the same amount of light energy. Everything is even. It's kind of flat. It's very information-packed. This is a good type of light to do paintings under because it's getting even illumination. You put in the color and the contrast and the brightness and the direction and all that into your painting. You don't want the lighting to add to that. You just want the lighting to record that information. But if you have some sort of dimensional object like a sculpture, then a side light or a backlight might be better to help bring out that form and that volume and that texture. So think about what you're trying to photograph and then try to find the light source to fit it. And then this non-directional light, it's early morning, diffused, it was overcast, there was a lot of rain, and the light is kind of coming from everywhere. There is a slight bias to the light coming down from the top, and it kind of works in this particular scene. But imagine if you had a sculpture of a figure and you put it in this kind of diffused top lighting, then the top part of the sculpture is going to catch most of the light, and you don't really draw the form of the verticalness of the sculpture. So a side light or a backlight might be better suited for some sort of vertical object, or some object that has dimensions and edges and planes that you want to have the light inform the viewer as to its shape. So front light is really great for flat work, and more side or backlight is really better for objects. Unless it's round like an egg, then perhaps you want the light coming from the top to help draw the form and the shape of this object that way and cast a shadow directly on the ground beneath it. So that's possible. So let's get back to work. We got to talk about exposure. This is the thing that's going to get a little technical, and I've really tried to make it as simple as I could make it. But if you don't get this the first time, you're in a club with a lot of members, because this is the hard thing to really appreciate over time. We have 4 things that make up the light, make up the exposure, forgive me. Light, how much is available, and we call this the ambient light. So in the previous 4 examples, that was the ambient light. It was coming from the side, it was coming from multiple directions, it was coming from the front, it was coming from the top, it was coming from the back. That was the ambient light. How much is there? In the early morning, it's not as brilliant as it is in the middle of the day. Or a light shining directly on something is more powerful than a light bouncing off a card and that diffused light illuminating an object. So how much light's available? The ISO sensitivity, we're going to talk about that. The higher the number, the less light you need to make a photograph. The higher the number, the less light you need, but of course the more artifacts and grain and noise you can introduce into the file. So we want to work with the lowest number ISO possible, given how much light and what the other 2 camera controls are doing. But as you can see, we can have ISOs up to 25,600. Currently, my 5D Mark II maxes out at 8,000. So this is triple that. This is more than triple the light sensitivity, the newer cameras coming out. Then shutter speeds. How long is the shutter open? From an 8,000th of a second, which is, I mean, it's quick. I mean, you can catch, an explosion at that speed. Or I sometimes have the camera open for an hour if I'm trying to do some sort of gathering in of like the moonlight or getting the stars to move across the sky. So the shutter speed varies greatly from a fraction of a second to whatever you'd like. And then the aperture is the size of the opening in the lens barrel from 0.4, pardon me, these are very fast lenses. They have a maximum opening. They let in a lot of light down to 256, which is like a pin-size hole. And that cuts down the amount of light intensity, but gives you great depth of field. But the working range for most of your cameras, if you look in your manuals, you'll see the working range is somewhere between 3.5 to f22 is what most camera lenses have. And your shutter speed range, you should check and see what that is, as well as see what your ISO settings are. Most cameras are probably 100 to maybe 2500 would be my guess. So it's going to vary. But here is the essential equation that we always have to calculate. There's no getting around it. It's the addition of these 4 things, the combination of the light sensitivity of the camera, how long the shutter is open, and how big the hole is in the lens. That's what makes up the exposure, these 4 things. And this is what we're going to try to understand. And this is where it gets a little technical, and it just takes a little bit of time to think about it. You know, we use units of measurement, inches, miles, kilometers, gallons, to measure units of whatever we're doing, liquids or time or distance or what have you. And in cameras and photography, we call it a stop. There are full stops, there are partial stops, but the unit of measurement is called a stop. And a one-stop change can double the amount of light, or double the exposure time, or double the light sensitivity, or it can cut it exactly in half depending on which way we're going with the camera control. And I'm certainly going to explain that in more detail. But this halving and doubling principle is the fundamental concept of photographic theory, and you really have to wrap your head around it to understand what your camera controls can do. So you can increase the exposure, which means the picture gets lighter, or you can decrease the exposure, which means the picture gets darker. And you can do that in full stops, which completely halves or doubles, or partial stops. So, for instance, if your shutter speed's at a 500th of a second and you change it to a 250th of a second, you're letting in twice as much light because the shutter is open twice as long. The fractional number is smaller, but the time has been increased. Now we're going to see a scale later that shows the intermediate steps. If this is a full stop change, we have doubled the amount of time. The fractional number got smaller from a 500 to a 250. The time is twice as long. The exposure has increased 100%. We've let in twice as much light. So this is the doubling principle. The f-stops work the same way. If we're at f8 and we're letting in X amount of light energy, and we stop the lens down, we turn the lens from the number 8 to the number 11, we've made the hole smaller by one full stop, and we've cut the light in half. And the picture gets darker by one stop. This is the halving principle. We cut the light down, we're halving the exposure. We double the light, we're doubling the exposure. So this halving and doubling thing we're going to see now throughout the rest of this little talk here. Now this is the only math I put in here, and I put it in for those of you who understand science and math and get fractions and all that. But this is another way to look at the information. A one-stop change doubles, 1 times 2, or it halves it, 1 divided by 2. A two-stop change doubles or halves the exposures again, which means either 4 times, 2 times because it's two-stop change, or it cuts it down to a quarter, 1/2 by 1/2. We stop down one stop, we stop down another stop. So this is just the math of what I'm saying in another way. It's either dividing or doubling. So the 3-stop change doubles or halves again. So every time we move a full stop, we're doubling or halving from the prior setting. So this is really just more information, and hopefully it has not confused anybody, but please, I'm happy to review this afterwards, but I just wanted to express this information in another way. So we control the exposure to influence the viewer's response or our own emotional response, and also to recreate reproducible images. If we want the picture to be reproduced in a brochure and we paint with a lot of dark colors, we better have a lot of exposure. We better have the proper exposure, enough information in the picture for the reproduction process to be able to use. So we're going to show you how to manipulate the camera controls by these 3 things. Here are the definitions of the 3 camera controls that we can control. We have some control over light, but not a whole lot. The length of time the shutter is open affects the amount of light reaching the sensor. So this choice of shutter speed also helps determine if you're going to be affected by camera shake or if moving objects will be blurry or sharp. Again, going back to that tripod thing, you can take pictures. I take pictures all the time at a quarter of a second, and they're tack sharp, but I'm on a tripod because I don't have enough light to get a faster shutter speed, and I want to stay at a certain aperture. So there are reasons why I'm going to work certain ways. The aperture is the size of the lens opening, and we call this, it affects the intensity. It also affects depth of field. So aperture also determines how much of your image is in focus. That's what depth of field means. Now, for most lenses, and you may want to write this one down, I did not put this in the presentation, but most lenses work at their optimum sharpness, 4 stops close down from their maximum opening, meaning maximum opening means the smallest number. So if your lens's smallest number is 3.5, then 4 stops down from that setting is typically when your lens is going to be the sharpest. So that would be f14, would be a 4-stop change, and you'll see a chart later on that will show you how I got there. So 4 stops from your maximum opening is typically what we call the sweet spot for a lens in terms of sharpness. You start going past that and you get what's called refraction, and you actually get the picture that has more depth of field, but it's not as crisp. Also, while we're on the topic of lenses, it just occurred to me that a zoom lens, which has many different lens length, lens choices from wide angle to telephoto in it, are not as sharp as prime lenses, which are one specific length, focal length it's called. So a 50 millimeter lens, that's all it is a 50 millimeter lens, is going to be sharper than a lens that allows you to go to 24 millimeters and 50 millimeters and maybe 105 millimeters. So if you're really if sharpness and clarity is super important, then you need to have a lens that has a specific and fixed focal length. When I'm doing work that requires a large degree of blow-up, I had a job I did last November. The picture had to be 50 inches across. I rented a specific lens for that because my zoom lenses would have done the job, but the picture would not have been as sharp. For some of my time-lapse work, a zoom lens is perfectly suitable. I don't have to worry about that, and I'm always changing my zoom because of what I'm trying to accomplish on the time-lapse. But prime lenses are always going to be sharper than zoom lenses. And then the last one on this chart here, ISO, how sensitive is the chip to the light? What is your setting on the sensor? How sensitive is it going to be to the light? So pardon me one second, if you would. This cold is catching up to me. Thank you. The amount of time light is allowed to accumulate onto the camera sensors is what the shutter speed controls. And you decide that by a variety of factors. Is the subject moving and you want to capture the movement in clarity, or do you want to create some kind of blur? If you're photographing an object on a table and you have a tripod, it doesn't really matter what shutter speed you use. If it's slowed down, it's not going to move because you're on a tripod. But think about this. What are you trying to accomplish will drive the shutter speed decision. So if you look on your camera, on the top of your camera, you'll see a series of numbers, 1/250, 1/60, 1/30. And those are fractional, 1/4 of a second, 1/30th of a second. If you see whole numbers, usually it's going to have a quotation mark on the right side. That's for seconds. 1 second, 2 seconds, 2.3 seconds, 5 seconds, 5.7 seconds. You'll see different numbers on there. So fractional numbers are much briefer amounts of time. So decide what you're trying to do, and then the right shutter speed will reveal itself. And then you should experiment to know what the difference is between a 1/30th of a second and a 1/10th of a second. Because a 1/10th of a second is a lot more time relative to a 1/30th, but it still may not be long enough to create any kind of movement depending on what your subject is doing. So this is where it takes some experimentation. This is the scale as you'll see it on your camera readout screen. The red colors are full stop changes, and the white numbers are the intermediate steps. So between the red numbers, every red number is a full stop. It halves or doubles. And if you look at the numbers, it pretty much follows, although there are some fractional issues, like from 1/60th to 125, if it was actually doubled, it would be a 20th, but to make the math work, they've kind of rounded it. In between, the two white numbers represent third stop changes. So you'll see those as well. And sometimes when you're manipulating your camera controls, maybe it just needs a little bump. Maybe it's just a 1/3 of a stop. Maybe I'm almost there, but I could use a little bit more, or I'm a little bit too bright. I just need a little bit less. And you can change an intermediate. You have control in your camera to change it into half stops as well, but most people work in third stops. It gives you a little bit more refined control. But for mostly what you're doing, I would suspect that full stop changes are probably going to be okay. But this is the scale. It's by all means not a complete scale. As I said, my camera goes up to an 8,000th of a second, and it goes up to 30 seconds on bulb. If I want to have it on a timer, I can go up to 30 seconds. But typically, if you're hand holding, right around 125th of a second to a 250th is probably a good shutter speed if you insist on hand holding and don't have a tripod. That pretty much will mitigate any kind of camera shake or herky-jerky movement you may have. So, for an example, how does shutter speed affect exposure? Now, in this series of pictures, the aperture is fixed at f.5.6, I'm sorry. The ISO is set at 200, and I've just changed my shutter speed. That's only camera control I changed. My camera's on a tripod, so I'm not moving it. This is diffuse lighting, and I just changed the shutter speed. I'm on manual, and I've just changed the shutter speed, and you can see the full stop changes in red. Now, a 30th of a second is not a bad exposure. The background's a little bright, but the flower looks kind of tasty. A 40th of a second is pretty good as well, and so is a 50th. We start getting to a 60th of a second in the lower left corner and on down the line, and the picture starts to get a little muddy. So I would argue that a 30th, a 40th, and a 50th are all pretty good exposures. And if I really had to pick, I would probably go with the 40th of a second. So you can see there's some variation. Between a 30th and a 60th, that's a pretty big jump if you look at those two exposures together. But the two intermediate steps, a 40th and a 50th, they give me some flexibility that I might not have if I just work in full jumps. So you can see we can get great change the effect of the picture by just manipulating that one camera control. Let's go to the next camera control. The intensity of water flowing through a pipe is controlled by changing the valve size. That's kind of what we have inside our lens. We control the intensity of the light by changing the iris opening in the lens or its valve. Now here's where it can get a little confusing for people. A big number represents a small valve opening, and a small number represents a big valve opening. And this is an inverse relationship. So back here, I'm at f5.6. I have a large opening but a small number, and I have limited depth of field. And we're going to see how this relationship works in a second. But we have to understand that when we stop down, we're making the hole smaller. And when we stop up, we're making the hole bigger. So try to use that language if you happen to be working with a photographer. Please stop down to give me a lot of depth of field. Or please open up to give me less depth of field. So stop down or stop up is a better way to specifically state what you're trying to accomplish. Oh, go to a small f-stop. What does a small f-stop mean? A small opening or a small number? I would argue there's some confusion in saying it that way. So how do you know which one to select? Again, going back to that very first picture, I wanted the background out of focus. So I picked a small aperture, f4, so I would have limited depth of field. But if you have a sculpture that has 2 or 3 feet of depth to it, depth to it, not left or right, but depth, then you're going to want to stop down to f8 or f11 or f16 and get that whole thing in focus. Flat art painting, stop down about 4 stops, get to the sweet spot on your lens, as I referenced earlier, and you're good to go. You don't need a lot of depth of field with flat artwork. You could actually shoot more opened up, maybe 2 stops down if you're more comfortable with that. So what are you trying to accomplish? So everything else being equal, a large lens opening allows more light to reach the sensor. Here is the scale that you'll typically find on your lens. Again, each red set of numbers represents a stop difference between, and the 2 white intermediate numbers are third stop changes. So the math, it gets fractional, 2.0, 2.8, 3.6. Some camera manufacturers, the lens is 3.5, and instead of 3.2 it might be 3.4, and some lenses might say 6.5, and some might say 7.0, but these are the mathematically correct numbers, but every manufacturer has a little bit of interpretation. In fact, 12.5, if you look on the second row, fourth number in, that's the mathematically correct number, but a lot of manufacturers put in 13 because it takes up less space on the dial. So each doubling of the number is a two-stop change on the aperture scale. Even though on the previous shutter speed scale, having or doubling, the number halved or doubled, but the aperture scale, you have to be careful. The scale works a little bit differently. From 2.0 to 2.8 is a one-stop change, and that halves or doubles. But the numerical sequencing, 2.0 to 4.0, is a doubling of the number, but it's not a doubling of the exposure because the aperture scale works a little bit differently in its numerical sequencing. So try to keep that in mind. This does confuse people a lot. We'll see all the scales in together a little bit later, and hopefully that'll help clarify. But if your lens is at f4, and I say stop down 4 stops to get to the sweet spot, so f4 to 5.6 is 1 stop, to 5.6 is, from 5.6 to f8 is 2 stops, from f8 to f11 is 3 stops, and from f11 to f16 is 4 stops. So if you had a lens whose maximum opening was f4, and I'm saying stop down 4 stops to get to the sweet spot of that lens, it would be f16, would be a 4-stop change. If we look at the red numbers and go 1, 2, 3, 4, we're at f16. So that's how you would determine your sweet spot for that particular lens. If the sweet spot was 3.6, then the 4 stops would be at f14 if we go and follow this scale. And here is a graphical representation of how the numbers work. f2.8 is a big hole in the lens. f22 is a smaller hole in the lens. First, how this scale works. Small number, big hole, big number, small hole, or val if you prefer. And again, going back to that same sequence of pictures, the shutter speed stays the same, the ISO is staying the same, and I'm only changing the aperture. And again, I would argue that 7.1, f8, f9, those are pretty good exposures. You start getting to f10 on the lower left corner, it's getting a little on the muddy side. Now, one of the phenomenons that occurs when you manipulate your exposure by changing the aperture is you get more depth of field. If you look at the bottom right picture, you see a lot more of the picture in focus than you do at f8 or you do at f9. So if you're going to manipulate your exposure by changing the aperture, be aware that you're also going to change the amount of information that's in focus. And if that's critical, then you're better off keeping the aperture fixed and changing your exposure by the shutter speed. And if the shutter speed gets too slow, then that's when you want to go to a tripod. So these are the things that you have to keep in the back of your mind, that some of the camera controls will change the feel of the picture in every way, in clarity of focus and brightness and darkness, and some will just change the brightness and darkness and not change the clarity so much. So keep that in mind when you're manipulating your camera controls. ISO is the next thing, the light sensitivity. A low ISO will require more light than a higher ISO. So in this previous picture, I was at ISO 200, the light was relatively powerful, it was in open shade, and I was able to get a decent shutter speed. A 20th of a second at f8 or f9 is pretty decent, so I could work with a low ISO. If you don't have a tripod and you don't have a lot of light and you've got to make the picture and you have to have it sharp and you have to shoot at f8 because that's the best aperture on your lens and you just have to work with that, then you have to change your ISO to affect the exposure. And you'll get your picture, but you may have some noise or artifacting that you can remove after the fact, but you may not be able to get all of it out. So this is my rule of thumb. If I'm shooting slower than a 60th, I want to go on a tripod because I'm no spring chicken anymore. I'm not as steady as I used to be, And although if I have to hold the camera at a 30th of a second, I will. And some lenses have image stabilization, but a tripod just takes care of all the issues. I don't have to worry about it. So I try to have a tripod with me at all times. Here's the ISO scale that you'll typically see in your camera. And again, the same rule of thumb between each red set of numbers. Each red set of numbers represents a full stop change, and there's 2 intermediate steps in between, or stops. And this follows the halving or doubling. 50 to 100 is twice as much light. From 100 to 50 is half as much light. So this scale and the shutter speed scale work just like the halving and doubling principle. The aperture scale is a little bit more confusing, so we have to try to keep that in mind. So if we go from ISO 100 to ISO 200, we're increasing the sensitivity 100%, and we have double the light sensitivity. Or sometimes we want to work in intermediate steps, and we have these choices here. As I said earlier, cameras now can go up to 25,800. If you're working, most cameras are optimized these days to be ideally set between 100 and 200. Some of the cameras work well at 400, but if you want to keep the quality as high as possible and the noise issues as low as possible, somewhere between 100 and 200 is your range. You got 4 choices there: 100, 125, 160, and 200. If you can stay in that range, you're going to have very high quality pictures. And again, going back to our last example, the aperture is at 5.6, the shutter speed is locked at 140, and I'm just changing the ISO to affect the density change. And you can see that perhaps ISO 100 or ISO 125 probably give me very good choices. I probably like ISO 100 the best. But if you keep all the other camera controls the same, the aperture and the shutter speed, and just change the ISO, you can affect the brightness or darkness of your picture. So what's the correct exposure? I'm going to drop down the histograms from all of these, and we can see the histogram is a scale. This is the one that shows up when your picture's on your computer. And when the information is jammed all the way to the far right, like you see in the upper left picture, that is called clipping. The highlights, that represents the bright areas of the picture, and they're gone, and there's no recovering them. All 3 channels are pushing off to the edge. You're overexposed. Conversely, the picture on the lower right, the density, the shadows are represented by the histogram on the far left-hand side of that scale on the lower right-hand picture. That detail is in the dark shadows. It's not going to reproduce. We want to try to get the details spread across the histogram. I would suggest that maybe F10 or F11 are probably the right exposures, maybe F9. So there is some variation within it. What's the right exposure? I would say between F9 and F11, given this particular scale, is probably the right. Any one of those 2 would work. If it was me, I would probably pick F10, go for the one in the middle, and be happy with that one. Looking at that histogram, I'm in pretty good shape. There's a little bit of clipping on the far left and the far right on the edges, but in this particular scene, most information that I want is in that graph, represented in the center part of the graph, and I can live with the little edges that might be lost in the reproduction. So looking at the histogram and in Photoshop afterwards can also help, but we'll look at it on the camera in a minute. So here's those scales again, just to look at, they work in concert, they work together, but they operate slightly different. Every 2 numbers is a doubling of the numeric number itself in the aperture scale. It's different than the halving or doubling of moving 1 stop in the exposure scale. So there's, again, it's a little bit tough on the aperture scale, but ISO and shutter speed, a halving and doubling is a halving or doubling of the number itself as well as the light and dark, and there's just a slight difference on that aperture scale. So if you are working in manual mode and the picture is under or overexposed, how do you change it? Well, we saw in the earlier pictures that by changing the ISO 1 stop or changing the shutter speed, or changing the diameter of the lens opening, we can make the picture lighter or darker. So this is sort of reinforcing what we looked at in those prior examples. So when you're working in manual mode, or perhaps you're working in one of the automatic modes, it can be light or dark. It just depends on circumstances. Now, that was a one-stop change that I was doing, but if you think it requires more than one stop, you have a choice. You can add the exposure. You can change 2 stops by using one camera control itself. You can move just the ISO, or just the shutter speed, or just the aperture. Or you can do a combination of the two. That's what I'm trying to say in this little screen here. Sometimes I'll change the ISO to make the picture brighter, and I'll slow down the shutter speed. I can do a combination. As long as I get to the right exposure and it requires more than one stop, I can mix and blend the camera controls. So don't be afraid. If you need to go from 200 to 400, it's not going to kill you. But if you don't want to go from 400 to 800, then you can slow the shutter speed down and add your exposure on that other stop by changing the shutter speed and not taking it all off the ISO scale because you're concerned about noise. So again, this is another iteration of that. You can just move one camera control or do a combination of the camera controls. It's very important to understand how you can manipulate those things. And again, this goes back to that prior screen. If you're working in the automatic modes, you can use your exposure compensation to set the camera brighter or darker. The prior screens we were going through talked about how to do it manual. But how do you know what the right exposure is? So look at the histogram. Here's a picture of some ants. And here's its histogram. And we're going to understand how it works. It's a scale that runs from 0 to 255. The shadows are represented on the left, the highlights on the right. In this particular histogram taken from Photoshop, I've also shown you the 3 color channels to show you that the composite, which is an average blend, and the individual channels are slightly different. So you could have some information bunched up at the edge of the scale where you're losing information, but depending on what you're trying to accomplish, that may be appropriate. For instance, in this picture of the ants, the dark black that's bunched up on the far left-hand side, that's pitch black. I don't want detail in there. So even though technically I'm losing information, aesthetically I'm okay with it because that's a black hole. I don't want to lose information in the highlights. I want that little rock, that light rock on the far left to not blow out. I want to see detail. And if I look at my histogram, I'm not getting to the edge there. So I have the information I need in this particular scene. So if you can understand the middle range of this histogram, mostly this is a middle tone picture. There is some dark shadows, but most of it's middle tone, not any real bright highlights. So you can start to see how the tones are distributed. Going back to this prior picture, again, I have information bunched up on the far left. That means the shadows are pitch black. But when I look into those shadows of the trees, I don't need to see information in there. I want the heaviness of that. That's part of the emotional content of the picture. I'm good. This is mostly a lower tone picture. There's not going to be any real highlights in there, and so the lighter values are very flat-lined in this histogram. So histograms are always contextual driven, and I would see a very similar histogram to this on my camera. This is a mostly high-key picture, and the bright values are blown out. They're going to be white, but that's paper white, and that's what I want. The middle values of this fern, these are part of my remnant series of fine artwork where I scan found objects. And I have some heavy blacks in there because I want some darkness, but mostly it's a middle tone and higher tone picture, and my histogram reflects it. I'm sort of mapping for you where the values fall, and you can start to identify, okay, by the histogram, I'm losing detail, but when I look at the picture, it's detail I can live with losing. I'm okay with it. I don't have to have detail everywhere is the point I'm trying to make. And then lastly, before we get into some fun stuff and some Q&A, going back to that flower picture, the concept of equivalent exposure This is sort of taking it more photographic for some of you folks who are into it a little bit deeper. But to understand, these two images demonstrate equivalent exposure. Both pictures have the same exposure value, but if you look at the camera controls in red, they're different combinations of camera controls gave me the same exposure value. And how I did that is, as one camera control moved, the other camera control moved in an equal but opposite direction. So I started out at a 60th of a second at f5.6, and as I lengthened the time the shutter was open to a 50th of a second, I closed the valve down to a 6.4. I'm moving in third stops here. As I slowed the shutter speed down again to a 40th of a second, letting in more light, I had to make the hole in the lens smaller to compensate for that extra amount of time light was getting through the lens. I had to make the hole in the lens a little bit smaller to balance the exposure. This is what we call equivalent exposure. Same amount of light energy getting into the camera through different combinations of camera controls, and one of them has a lot of depth of field and one of them has a very shallow depth of field. But they're still the same values of light. And as I go through this, I'm working with the same value of light in the scene. I'm sorry, I misspoke there. And as you see, as I go through the scale here, as I increase the time the shutter's open, I have to decrease the intensity or stop down the lens. Or if I work backwards, as I increase the time, as I decrease the time the shutter's open, I have to open up the lens to compensate for that less amount of time. I have to increase the flow of light through the lens to balance the exposure. So this is what we mean by equivalent exposure. As one camera control moves, the other camera control moves in an equal but opposite direction. So before we get into some simple stuff, are there any questions I can address?
Michael, I think that I think all of the other questions are going to be kind of general. Will kind of be best suited if we do them all at once. So do you want to do that now, or do you want me to wait until? Well,
let me just go through a couple of things to think about in pictures, and we can do the questions at the end.
Sure.
Okay. So this is very simple stuff to go through really quick. We're done with all the heavy lifting here. A light background and a dark background. Same lighting, same object, same time of day. I just put the photo of the object in front of a dark background. Think of contrast between light and dark. Points of view. When we're taking pictures, the camera on the upper left is a low horizontal, eye level horizontal, high level. So think about how your camera is. Your camera moves up and down. When you're making your pictures, your camera moves up and down. On the low level, there's less distortion in the upper left picture than the picture on the far right because I'm tipping down slightly. So by having the camera move up and down vertically, I can minimize some distortion. So points of view are important. Some other points of view, again, this is all done with 35 millimeter. I'm very conscious that the camera is on a tripod. I'm not hand holding it. I'm trying to make sure the camera is perpendicular to the walls in my subject. It's on a tripod. You can buy a little bubble level to go on your camera, or you can just buy a regular copperness level and set it on your tripod head. Make sure it's level and then mount the camera. But it's important to have everything squared up when you're doing your pictures. You'll minimize distortion. So these can be done. These are all 35 millimeter. I do these for a historical homes tour that I'm involved in. But just eye level, low, high, you can call it what you'd like. And then depth of field, we saw that earlier. The one on the left has limited or selected depth of field. The one on the right has maximum depth of field. And then can we guess the shutter speed in this photo? Was it a short shutter speed or long shutter speed? And because the movement of the water is being recorded, the shutter speed was open long. Probably a 15th of a second or an 1/8 of a second would be my guess. Here, the water is crisp and frozen. So this was a quick shutter speed, probably a 60th of a second or 125th of a second. I don't remember when what I used when I did this. But by looking at some pictures, we can start to determine here the water's kind of fuzzy. It's early morning, so the water's not moving fast like the picture in the upper left. The water's moving fast. They're in the middle of the day. But this early morning light, the water's moving slower, but it's still kind of fuzzy, probably a long shutter speed. And in fact, it was a second. I remember doing that picture. Again, middle of the day, the water's frozen. It's not like the picture on the far left where there's movements being recorded. This movement is being frozen. So this was a fast shutter speed, probably 125th or a 200th of a second. There's still a little bit of fuzz to it, so it wasn't super fast. I could have certainly gone up to 1,000 if I wanted to. So these are the things that we want to go through. We talked about today. White balance, color space, file format, picture style, what's our exposure mode, let's set our histogram to color, let's format the card, what is our ISO shutter speed and aperture settings, and if we want to think about equivalent exposures. I go through these things through my mind every time. I have my manual with me in the field. The manuals are heavy. They got a lot of technical information. I don't know everything. I refer to the manual. So keep it with you to help you understand some of these settings. And I thank you for your time. And Jason, I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, good. I have a number of questions here, and I'm going to pull a couple of them together and kind of summarize what several people are looking for. For artists who are shooting their own artwork, say they're shooting their paintings or their sculptures, could you give a kind of basically what would be your approach to, say, shooting a painting or a sculpture if you don't have a professional light setup? What would be your approach to trying to capture the best possible photo you could get in that kind of scenario?
Well, given some of the examples that I showed in the presentation, I look for diffused, slightly directional light for shooting an object. And even though some of the examples I showed the environment, you could get some seamless paper or some fabric and drape it over a chair or make some sort of stand and sweep it onto the table. Like get a kitchen table and maybe some high back chairs and put some cloth over the high back chairs, lay it on the table, and if your object is small enough, you can put your object on there, and if it's close to a window, let the window light illuminate it, and then put a white card on the other side. That's possible. If you don't like if the texture of the background is going to add to the picture, then go to a camera supply store or an art supply store and get some seamless paper. They make them in 4.5-foot widths by 36 yards, 36 feet long, different colors. You can buy a simple stand setup or get 2 poles and put a broomstick, a rod like a closet rod, a hanger rod, and run the paper through. And you can, if you get it on stands, you can vary the height if your sculpture is 2 or 3 feet tall, or if the sculpture is just too big to put on a table, if you can find a corner where 2 walls and a floor meet that's relatively clean, and put the object several feet in front of that corner and introduce some light, either window light or buy some floodlights from Home Depot and clamp them on a chair and put a cloth between the light and the object so the light is diffused, and have some white cards on the other side. Remember, if it's a 3-foot tall sculpture, get a 6-foot tall card so it throws an even light back onto it. Softer light is better. If it's dimensional, coming from the side, will give you shape, form, color, and texture. If it's flat art, your contrast and color is built into the flat art. So if you are on a patio and the sun's at high noon and it's bouncing off the ground, but you're underneath a covered patio, if you can hang the light on the wall next to the house that's underneath the shade of the patio, that light's going to be pretty good. It's going to be pretty even. I would definitely shoot one of those color targets or the spider cube in one of the pictures so you can get the color balance correct. because that color is going to, if it's coming in from grass, it's going to have kind of a green color. If there's concrete or asphalt, it's going to pick up that color. So you need to have one of those color targets in there so you can use an eyedropper tool in one of your image editing programs to neutralize the color. And then that's pretty good color. You know, indirect light for paintings is always good, but if you're going to light it, use two lights, one on either side. Indirect light, you can kind of get away. You can kind of get away with light bouncing in. You know, you and I are talking about doing some of these demos in another program, so I'm certainly happy to demonstrate this. But bounce light is good for flat art, but if you're going to light it, get two lights at equal value on either side of the artwork.
Great. And as far as getting the reflector cards and the targets, would you recommend that artists try to work with their local camera shop where they can have someone that's knowledgeable on hand, or is it better to order online and you know, get the better price?
Well, I hate to say this, but I go into stores and do my test driving first and then order better. I really hate to say that because it's a lousy thing to do to retailers. But if you can develop, you know, a lot of retail stores now have classes, or if you can develop a relationship with a junior college in the photography department and get to know some students, or maybe take a class to find out information. Develop a relationship with a camera store is great, but understand that their job is to sell you something. And do your research online first. Like I gave you my preferences on the color targets. There's all kinds out there, and trust me, I've tried them all, and I find these to be the most simple and straightforward and effective. So I've kind of done some of the homework for you. But in terms of equipment, you want it sturdy. You're not doing heavy-duty work, and you know, if you're a good read of a person's character, you know, go through a couple different salespeople, try a couple different people, and see how they talk to you. I'm happy to address questions. If you know, you see my email, Jason. You can send them my email address. It'll be on this presentation. I'm happy to help walk you through it. You know, I do a lot of research online first, and then I talk to camera stores. Sometimes I buy from them. Sometimes I buy online.
Great. And I'm going to go ahead, and again, we're going to try and get some audible questions in, and I want to lower all the hands because I know I've had some that have been up for a while. So if you do have an audible question, go ahead and go back in and raise your hand again.
The audio is really funky. It's hard to hear you.
We may have a little bit of, depending on the internet connection, sometimes we can lose a little bit of audio. So am I back on now?
I can hear you, but it's in and out and really wonky. So I'll try to listen carefully.
Okay. Let's take another question. And again, if I was cutting out there, I apologize. If you have an audible question and can click on the hand icon again, that lets me know. I lowered the hands so that we could start fresh. This question comes from Bill Inman, and he says, for some reason, my Canon will lock onto the scene, focus in and out, and not take a picture. I've had this happen in many different modes. What am I doing wrong?
Jason, I think you're asking that the gentleman is having trouble focusing. The autofocus is not working.
That's correct.
Okay. Autofocus works best on areas of high contrast. So if you can set multiple focus points on the camera, or just a specific focus point by turning the dial and looking through the viewfinder, you see little red squares light up. If autofocus doesn't work, you need to go to manual focus, and when your camera is in focus and you push the shutter button halfway down, well, the red squares will light up. So it may be an issue of low contrast, and you'll have to go to manual focus. There's also a thing called a diopter in your viewfinder, and you need to adjust that to match your eye. If you always wear glasses, you should look through the viewfinder with your glasses on and focus on something and turn the diopter. If you focus on something at infinity, you're standing at your front door and you're focusing on the house across the street, and if its lens is at infinity and it's still fuzzy, then adjust the little diopter setting in the viewfinder, and then you'll be adjusted for your eye, and then you can do manual focus with a lot more confidence. But it sounds like the manual focus, the autofocus is having a hard time finding something with a lot of contrast.
Okay, and Roberta Sutherland says, when photographing my work, there's often some glare bouncing off the painting. It's a glazed surface. Any suggestions for dealing with glazed surfaces or highly reflective surfaces?
With glare, yes. They're always tough. Polarized light by polarized gels that go over your light, and then by a polarizing filter that screws onto your lens, and by forcing the light to illuminate in only a single lighting plane, the glaze or the glare will go away. If that's not possible, you'll have to photograph the object, the artwork, slightly off-center, and then the glare should go away to some degree, and you can just square it up in post-production. Those are always tough to do. The simplest method, polarizing shields or gels, they come in holders. You can buy them, I think, 12 inches square.
Michael, are you there? I'm sorry. It looks like I had lost my internet connection temporarily. Now, we apologize for technical problems that we're having here. It seems like just the last few minutes of the call, we've lost it. We're going to, if you can hear me, we're going to continue, I guess, this conversation, the question and answer on our blog.